Welcome back, everybody. Thank you for joining us again on the Inspire Health podcast. And we are continuing on with the series on life, death, and beyond, exploring our greater reality. And today we have Neil Douglas-Klotz. And when I came across Neil's book, which is this one here, one of many, but this one particularly, I thought this was really timely for this series. And this book is called Revelations of the Aramaic Jesus, The Hidden Teachings on Life and Death. And Neil's a renowned writer, teacher, artist in the fields of Middle Eastern spirituality and the translation and interpretation of the ancient Semitic languages of Hebrew, Aramaic, and Arabic. Living in Scotland, he was for many years the co-chair of the mysticism group of the American Academy of Religion. He has written several books on the Aramaic spirituality of Jesus, as well as native Middle Eastern spirituality, Sufi spirituality. And then I thought this was really fascinating, Neil, that you also edited 4 collections of the work of Middle Eastern mystic Khalil Gibran, who I just love his work too. So you've got such a beautiful, eclectic way of I think deciphering a lot of these messages from whether the mystics or from Jesus himself. And I thought this is just going to be fascinating to have a conversation with you, literally to try and pull in what were the perspectives from Jesus on life and death and how we can live a more beautiful life. So thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, Jason. Thanks, Taya. Happy to be here.
Yeah, I think this will be really fun. So maybe you can start off with just give us a little bit of a background on yourself and how you came to be so interested in this area. I mean, this is really quite a niche area to focus decades of your life on.
I thought so too, actually. No, I was raised hearing different languages in my birth family. Not Aramaic, but German, Polish, Yiddish, Russian, a bit of Russian. And of course, I was raised I shouldn't say of course, but I was raised in the US. In one of the suburbs of Chicago, but my family was sort of multilingual, and my father, as you know, was a chiropractor. So my parents were already into what we now would call alternative health, and then in addition, although we were sent to more or less traditional religious Protestant schools. My parents were really not that interested in traditional religion. They were more interested in the work of Edgar Cayce, the American mystic. And then they were interested in Rachel Carson, one of the early, pioneers of the ecological movement. So this is what I was raised with. And, when I went to, fast forward, when I went to university, I sort of shrugged off all of the religious upbringing that I got through school, and having to memorize large parts of the Bible and theology and all of that stuff, and just went on, sort of a search for what really mattered. Again, fast forwarding a bit, I ended up being an investigative journalist when I came out of university and was working in New York City on a consumer protection publication. But I was very dissatisfied, not with what I was actually doing, which was trying to uncover what was really the truth about the food and the drugs and all of these things that were pervasive in culture, even in the 1970s, which is when I was working. And I had sources in the Food and Drug Administration and all the things that you do. But as a young man, I was very idealistic, and I wanted to tell people positive things that they could do to help themselves. Now, of course, that would be a no-brainer, but my editor was telling me, "No, Neil, you're doing good work, but you need to make people more afraid, because only fear sells." And this was, I'm telling you, this was in 1973.
Well, not much has changed in that regard.
Not much has changed, and in fact, it's gotten more so. Whether you look in print publications or internet or whatever, social media, it's all gone, more in that direction. And so I was interested. I went to work for an alternative news service for a while, and then I burnt out because I was telling people all this information, but there wasn't much change really happening. And I sort of reached an early burnout in my late 20s and went on a spiritual search, and this is where I ended up finding chanting. Uh, I was working with the Sufis, and because I had editing and writing skills, I was editing the diaries of the person who started the Dances of Universal Peace, whose name was Samuel Lewis. And Samuel Lewis said he wanted to learn how, before he died, he wanted to learn how to pray the Lord's Prayer in Aramaic.
Mhm.
But he had died and he hadn't done that. So I decided, well, if he thinks it was important, maybe there's something there. So that was how I went down that rabbit hole, basically. And I began just chanting what I could find of Aramaic without really knowing much about it, and began having rather profound spiritual experiences. But after that, then I was having met Matthew Fox later, Dr. Matthew Fox at the Creation Spirituality University where I was working. Matt encouraged me to learn Aramaic properly, and which I did, and then I began to write books and try to bring the spiritual and the intellectual together in those books, which began with the book Prayers of the Cosmos.
Mm.
So that's in the nutshell how I started. And then I thought, well, that's enough. Aramaic, who wants to know about it? But surprisingly, Prayers of the Cosmos took off and still actually is going. So
Yeah, I think that, well, I think why it probably is taking off too is I feel like in a lot of ways people just want to, people are getting, I think, more and more open to just wanting to understand the greater reality better. And what I've kind of found is even, growing up through going through Protestant United Church, and I generally all had a really good experience with it. But I remember even hearing different passages, and some would land for me in a certain way, and other ones I couldn't quite grasp what it really meant, or it actually felt off. Sometimes it would
yeah,
actually I would feel a strong sense of like judgment or something, and that didn't really resonate with my concept of divinity, even as a child. And
yeah,
so
I know.
I think like when I was going through your work and reading it, there's a lot of expansiveness to the message that I think is probably landing for people in a way that is tangible. It's like you can feel it a little bit more. It makes it real. And so that's kind of where I'd love to jump into. I mean, you
Sure,
said a
let's
lot
go.
of things there too. Even before you were talking about your experience being an investigative reporter, it's tricky, trying to figure out, you don't want stuff to be landing where it's only fear, but you're wanting to bring a certain level of awareness, but without it being then completely tethered to a fear response around everything.
Yes.
It's a tricky dynamic trying to bring information and then being able to have people sort of hold it in a place of neutrality to then see what their internal instructions tell them to do with it without being so tied into fear response. So
Yeah, agreed. Yeah, that's
yeah.
right.
All right, so maybe we'll start with what is Aramaic? Because I think a lot of people might
Okay.
not be so familiar with it. And why is it so helpful to specifically view the teachings from Jesus from that Aramaic lens? What makes that unique?
Well, Aramaic, not Aromatic, but Aramaic, one is the common spoken language of that area at the time that Jesus lived. So it was his native language, and it was the native language of, well, all of his listeners, all of the common people at his time. Although that area of the what's now called the Holy Land or Palestine, Israel, parts of Syria, they were under Roman domination at the time. Only those who were collaborating with the Roman Empire would have spoken any Latin or Greek. So the language is important in that Aramaic is an ancient Semitic language, like ancient Hebrew, like ancient Egyptian, and others. Classical Arabic was mentioned. And they have an entirely different worldview. So it's not just about the grammar and the words and the meaning of words, but it's about the way that people at that time viewed life, viewed the world, viewed the nature, viewed each other, and viewed reality. And that is very, very different from the way it came to be, and which is the way most of us in Western culture have inherited. So that's really it.
So what was when we think about the worldview back then, if we kind of go back in time to that point in time where Jesus was there and actually speaking, what was the worldview at that point? And I guess, how is it different now? And are the teachings relevant in the same way or even more so for us now?
Yeah, I mean, here are just a few bits that I usually tell people. Aramaic does not have a split between the inner world and the outer world. That means that the same preposition that means within, as in within me, is also the preposition that means among, that it, or between, or among us. So this inner outer split, that my thoughts, feelings, emotions are only mine and don't affect anything in my world, or that my world does not affect that. It's like, just here's my private inner world, and this did not exist at that time. Again, Semitic languages come from a nomadic background when people pre-agriculturally, before agriculture, they were just traveling, and they felt embedded with their environment and with their tribe and with everything, and with all of that. So in addition, there isn't a split between what's sacred or spiritual and what is, you could say, earthly or secular. Those concepts don't exist in the ancient Semitic languages. You don't have like God up there or the goddess or whatever, and me down here, poor me, stuck in my body. So there's no denigration of the body or of embodied life or of earthly life. That's just as sacred as everything else for Aramaic. You don't have this sacred profane split. In addition, there's no split between the past, present, and future, really. Or you could say that they're a continuum that are in process. If we look at it simply, it's as though I'm in a nomadic caravan and the ancestors are traveling ahead of me. And so this aheadness, they started the caravan, I'm following in their footsteps. That's the past ahead of me. And here I am, I'm traveling. The ancestors are still traveling. I just don't see them. They're in the unseen realm. They've gone to the unseen. And then my ancestors, my children's children, they're traveling too, but they're behind me. I don't see them yet because they're not born. So the next generation and the next generation, they're behind me and also traveling. So you have this continuum. And there's a great sense of responsibility. What I do is going to affect those coming after me. What I do is going to affect those coming after me. Now, who do I choose to follow in terms of my ancestors that are traveling ahead of me? Well, I want to choose the best ones, don't I? I don't want to choose the people who went off. And so I get a choice as to who I follow, or whom I follow. And that's an important choice to make, because there are still choices to make every moment. So these are huge differences for Yeshua, for Jesus. Yeshua is his Aramaic name.
Mm-hmm. I think that's so beautiful, and that really, I mean, that's even reminds me of the way we would see even some of the different Native American cultures, the way that they would view stuff. A lot of times they would talk about, you're doing things for 7 generations in the future as well. And what's also really neat is it's like that concept is really being rebirthed again, I think, through like quantum physics and sort of this concept of metaphysics too. It's like we are sort of seeing our worldview is changing to being this much larger perspective of almost like a unity model in some capacity. And you're kind of getting both pieces. I think it's like lots of separation, then lots of this other perspective too. And I feel like that's kind of where we are right now, is trying to figure out what resonates with you and which direction do you kind of want to focus on. But I think that's all really beautiful, and it completely changes. I know, even just from when you were not a parent to when you become a parent, it's almost like just that perspective where you know that what you're doing is not just about you anymore. It's kind of about very, very real dynamic with your kids. There's a change in that. This is sort of taking that to sort of the next nth degree, I think, around how our actions influence not just ourselves, but everything around us.
Yes, I mean we've sort of lost that over the last 5 centuries or so. But we can consciously choose those things now. You could say what came naturally to us as human beings in our consciousness 1,000, 2,000, 10,000 years ago, 100,000 years ago. It's a long history. What came naturally in terms of this embeddedness, or what Thich Nhat Hanh calls an interbeingness, this we can reclaim this part of our heritage with our own heart, with our own choices, and all of this. And this is really one of the major messages that Jesus comes with, really.
That's really interesting. In a conversation that we were having with Kathy O'Brien, she spoke about the forces that have tried to control global societies have known that if they can control and set into place certain things for 3 generations, then at that time onward for generations coming, it's just going to be automatic. That's just going to be what they know, how they function, how they perceive
Yes.
the world, and their reality. And when we were speaking with Paul Selig, the guides had spoken through him that we're the change that we're in, the shift that we're in, is essentially going to be taking place within 4 generations.
Mhm.
But what's really interesting in the conversations that we have amongst ourselves and hearing you speak of it, if we are more conscious of where we are right now and the choices that we make and the perception and the lens that we have on, then we can actually accelerate the changes that we want to ultimately see within our world now on a moment to moment basis.
Yes, I agree perfectly, Taya. Um, the shifts in consciousness, we'll call them that quite simply, that each of us does is extremely important. And they will not appear on a graph. They will not appear in any quantifiable form, in a statistic, in a journalistic report, in anything like that, because that's not that whole outerness where you count numbers and it's all about the material existence and about the news headlines. That degree of outerness is all that's recognized by Western science or Western journalism or even most of Western history. Very few people talk about a evolution of consciousness, which is really what we're talking about. It's a theme I sort of emphasize again and again, even when I'm talking about Jesus or, Aramaic and what all these different Bible passages mean. The notion of the evolution of human consciousness is extremely, extremely important. We cannot presume that people 2,000 or 20,000 years ago looked at reality, they had the same consciousness that we do. It wasn't. It absolutely wasn't. And anyone that's interested in this, they can read Theo de Chardin or Owen Barfield or a lot of other people who were early in this field and have noted this. And there's a lot of this in my new book relating it to Yeshua. Because Yeshua comes at this particular time when human consciousness is clearly becoming more self-oriented, that is, more me-oriented. And now 2,000 years later, we see sort of almost the nth degree of that, where it's all about me, 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 me. So Jesus is showing, okay, yes, you have an individual self, but here's what you can do with it. Here's what you can do with it. You can choose to be connected to the unseen realm, and you can choose to be connected to each other, to nature. Uh, and these are very, very important teachings that he gives us.
Neil, from your perspective, why did we start to become so disconnected from that over this time period? What are some of the reasons why we have kind of lost that? I mean, even from a perspective, I think of nature, our concepts with nature have dramatically changed. Because even when you talked to me about originally coming from a chiropractic family, I know when I've talked to old school chiropractors and old school naturopathic doctors, I mean, I feel like within that was a reverence for nature, an understanding of our multidimensionality of being a physical, mental, emotional, spiritual being. All of these things intersect. Those were really ingrained philosophies. And then, but it definitely, there's been more and more of a separation. From your perspective, what are some of the things that cause us to be more separate from that? And then what is the path to start to reconnect back to it?
Okay, well now we get down to it, Jason. So I mean, these are very important questions. They may be the most important questions. I know, chiropractic, early chiropractic at least, had this notion, and many other natural modalities, healing modalities do, that the body has its own wisdom, it has its own intelligence. And so if we just orient the body correctly to its surroundings, to itself, to nature, then it will heal itself. And this was an intuition that comes later to many natural alternative remedies, but it was a normal human notion in the earlier times, in the times 5 or 10,000 years ago. That's very clear. Now, in answer to your question, it seems to me that it was necessary that the human self develop. And by the human self, I mean the individual sense of myself, of the I, of the me in the world. Whereas before, and here I'm leaning on some of the authors that I mentioned, we were embedded in the natural world, but there was very little sense of a separation between me and the natural world. As I mentioned, this inner-outer split, barely there, not really there at all. It's like a transparency. So that when I look at a tree, for instance, I see not just the wood or the branches, but I see sort of a spiritual being, if you will, altogether. And so what we would call today my outer life is really much more like what today is my dream life. I'm taking a pause there just so people can sit with that. So it's like I was wearing my subconscious on the outside, if that makes any sense. But again, that's almost a koan. This is how different things were from the way we look at life today. So fast forward, the human self develops, the sense of separation, I from you, I from nature, me and above and below and all of this. And so we're constantly trying to reclaim these connections, connect through different ways, natural healing remedies, through alternative spiritualities. All of this, these are conscious choices that we're making. Why? So that we develop our will, our heart and our will. So the human individual heart and will is developing. And you could say, well, but look at all this stuff going on around us. I'll use the polite word. How is that part of any natural, divine, or otherwise, evolution? But this is, I suppose, so that we can look out and see, well, that choice was pretty poor, wasn't it? And we need to stop making that choice. But the impetus for it was to, you could say, again, using the terms that Jesus would have used, that myself, what he calls nafsha, my individual breath in this body, wants what my soul, my rucha, the breath that is everywhere and all the time connected, already has. You could say this breath that is the fully connected breath from before my birth and that will continue after my so-called physical death, this self, this sort of soul already has everything. It already possesses everything. So, but myself wants to go out and try to, okay, I want to grasp this, I want to get that, I want to get this, I want to own this and do that and control nature and, dominate this and have a war here or whatever. So, these are still, parts of that same evolution. They're just not playing out in what Yeshua would call a ripe manner, R-I-P-E. That is, they're not playing out in a timely, appropriate, blessed way.
Neil, when you were talking about that we were very much absolutely entwined with nature originally, I've done a fair bit of work in something called biogeometry, which was really fascinating, by Dr. Ibrahim Karim. And I've done some trainings with that. And he takes a lot of the ancient Egyptian culture, and he's an architect, but he looks at everything through this lens of sort of angle and design. and whatnot, and how that actually, through angle design, actually connects us to a lot of this unseen spectrum of different energies that we are not able to see through the five senses necessarily. Really fascinating work. But when he was talking about the where we kind of were to where we are now, and he talked about it from a perspective of right and left brains in some regard, but he said, originally there was no separation between the human being and the earth and nature. It was like we were very much a part of it, very much like animals in nature, like very much. You couldn't separate it. And then as we started the left brain functions were coming online and we were exploring more of the individuality, then we started to kind of create a little bit of separation from it, but that we could still connect very much to it because we were aware of it, but we would connect through it through ritual, through prayer, through ceremony. These were sort of our sacred ways of then connecting back into that and having a reverence for it, tying back to divinity in many ways. And then as that carried on, we got way too skewed over where we've kind of taken that individual part so much that we've now lost a lot of that right brain sort of aspect of it. And now we're in that process of sort of transitioning back. And this is where even the practices, when I go through your book, you'll go through a teaching and then you give a very practical exercise that you can incorporate to have a tangible experience with it. This is a really beautiful part about, I think, what's happening right now is that, and why I think people are resonating with these teachings, because it's allowing people to come back to create that tangible experience with this, for lack of a better word, just this divine energy, whatever people kind of know there's something more.
Yeah, there are many ways to do this, Jason, obviously too. And I've been writing these books and doing these workshops over 40 years or whatever, and chanting Aramaic with different melodies with people people who find that they have a heart feeling for this guy, for Yeshua, for Jesus. And you don't have to be Christian to have that. You may have been raised Christian and rejected 90% of what they were telling you about it, but you still had a feeling in your heart, there's something there. That certainly was my experience. So the books and all these things, they're written to help people sort of shed some of this baggage. And I would maintain that even if people don't believe they have this baggage and they've totally gone off religion, completely, that there's still a lot of this that impacted Western culture. To mention a few of the isms that developed from an interpretation of the Bible, we could mention colonialism, which is based on a misinterpretation of Genesis, that we should go out and dominate and subdue the earth. That's a false translation. And then if there's no human beings that are dominating and subduing the earth, we have the right to go and dominate and subdue them, like the native peoples, for instance. I mean, that's justified by a Christian theological view of a mistranslation of the Hebrew of Genesis, and that becomes colonialism. I'm not saying religion created it, but religion sort of propped it up. And then we can think about the split between the sexes, men and women, so-called, racism, ecocide. All these things actually have been impacted by even a secular Western view that is based on a lot of these false notions about this guy Jesus.
Well, that's a good way to segue in. Go ahead, hon.
I was just going to ask Neil, where is the place or the relevance of the heart in knowing Yeshua's teachings? I know that as Jason was reading some of the passages from your book out loud, I know the part of me that it really spoke to in a very tangible way was the heart. It felt so heartwarming and comforting. And it was just like I could feel the energy concentrating around the heart. Mystics and poets have spoken a lot about the heart as well. What did Yeshua say about the heart?
He has much to say about the heart, Taya, and thank you for sharing that, actually. For Jesus, the Aramaic word for heart is leba, or lebha, and it really is that center point that you could say where my individual life and the life of everything and all the time, my soul life, comes together. Again, maps are sometimes divisive and and overly simplistic, but it's as though, my soul is much bigger than me and my individual life. But my individual life is also important. So the heart is where those come together. Aramaic doesn't actually even have a word for mind as we would think of it today. It doesn't have a separation between what we call mind, body, soul, spirit. It doesn't have any of that. I mean, the word for spirit actually means breath in Aramaic or even ancient Hebrew. So the breath was considered to be sacred. And feeling my breath in the heart with love, with courage, with thankfulness, dare I say, with devotion, all these things are very, very important. And there's some of what he came to bring. He says he comes to give you life energy, and to give it much more abundantly than what you have. Even at Yeshua's time, these spiritual experiences of the heart, which we find cross-culturally in the ancient world, everywhere, as elsewhere, they had been, to use a word, they had been colonized by forms of religion. The spiritual energy is used to empower, to fuel a religious organization, if you will. Now, these organizations change throughout the world, and different prophets come, prophetesses, throughout the world history, throughout the world. But the isms that these become, or the anities, the inanities that these become, these are like, Jason was talking about the rituals. People, if you read the history of religions, they say, well, these religions invented so and such rituals. No, it wasn't that at all. The rituals, the chanting, the body awareness, the sacred dancing, these come first. They get colonized by all these different religious organizations that then develop, and then they start to worship, then they start to worship the thing rather than the goal. The goal is to connect. The goal is to connect with each other, connect with all that is, simple. But then the specific rituals become placed on an altar in some form. And I don't care if it's Christianity or Buddhism or any of the Hinduisms or any of these things, the attention gets placed on the thing, on the ritual, on the device, rather than what the device, so to speak, is for. And this is where we are now. That's why people are listening to this podcast and others like them, because they're breaking out of these things. And so we have people having mystical experiences all over the place without any prerequisite, shall we say, without having to go onto a particular temple, church, Gurdwara or whatever, or Zen center or any of these things. Or if they have been, it wasn't helping. So then they went and had their own experiences. And that's just where we are now. And this is the good part, you see, Jason. This is where the evolution of the human self, of the individuality, is breaking through, is starting to break through all of these ceilings that have been placed on us. And I don't just mean by organized religions, I mean also it can be by different spiritual groups, or people think, well, just come join our group, then you'll be safe, and we have the right thing, and, yada, 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 all that. So people are rejecting these things now, and I think it's just a natural trend.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
sorry, I'm going on a bit about it.
No, I think that was perfect. And even when you were talking about isms and some of these different things, I remember an author who I really enjoyed a lot of the teachings from was Dr. David Hawkins, and he did a whole scale on consciousness, and it talked about that for quite a while. A really beautiful, beautiful person. And he would talk about, so he had kind of created a scale of consciousness that he could calibrate. And he would talk about some of the original avatars like Jesus, who would come down with his original message would be at a absolute purity, be at like highest you can get, like 1,000 on the scale. And then as those messages got often interpreted by people that were not at the same level of consciousness, they weren't grasping, and it's almost like the broken telephone. It just gradually comes down more and more and more. And then a lot of times the bodies of the religions that take these messages are much less than what the original message of the actual avatar was that spoke them. So This is where I think then we get some of the misinterpretations. And then he also said when you actually attach ism to almost anything, it drops it right below the level of
Yeah,
actual
right down.
even
Yeah, I'm
truth.
familiar with. I've seen David
Yeah.
Hawkins' scale. It's very useful. It's interesting.
Mhm.
It's exactly right.
So I
So
thought that was fascinating. So Neil, what, from your perspective, what are some of the, and I know there could be a lot, but from when you've gone through it, what were some of the teachings where when you actually started to interpret them through the Aramaic lens, where you're like, holy cow, like that says something so different than what it sounded like in when we just read it in English and the wording around it. What were some of the biggest, whether it was the Beatitudes that Jesus spoke about on the Sermon on the Mount, or the Lord's Prayer, again from the Sermon on the Mount, that really spoke to you that were really valuable to share with people, that they maybe only got a portion of the full message, and there is so much more there for people to embrace.
yeah, I know it's hard to know where to begin. I mean, even the word prayer in Aramaic is basically equivalent to meditation in our language. So prayer doesn't necessarily mean saying words to someone up there or anywhere else. It can involve intoning words or sounds, but prayer is really a way of opening oneself to the larger reality. So although we talk about Jesus's prayer, the so-called Lord's Prayer, although he never called it that, that prayer, which I go through in the new book, is really a step-by-step meditation to open, find empowerment, you know, then make choices about our lives, learn or let awaken within us how to handle our human community, and then offer it all up back to the source. I mean, that's in 30 seconds, the whole prayer. It's much more subtle than that in Aramaic, but that's where basically it goes. That's very different than just saying, "Our Father which art in heaven, hallowed be thy name," etc., etc. The Beatitudes are similar. I mean, there's so much that's mistranslated in the Beatitudes. I'll just start with the first one. I mean, usually it's translated, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, uh, for they shall," I forgot, "they shall do something."
They shall inherit. Is that they shall inherit the earth? Right.
Blessed are the poor in spirit. Uh, to them belongs the kingdom of heaven.
Right.
Tu behun lemiskeni baruch tilhone malkuta dashmaya. The Aramaic says ripe, in the right time at the right place. This is overall what Jesus uses as the word when you see good or blessed or blessed, or however you want to pronounce it, in the New Testament. Just cross that out and write ripe above it, at the right time at the right place. And that means at the right time at the right place with one's, you could say, with one's soul, or with one's sort of deeper self, as Jung would call it, the capital S self. You're in tune in time with what is yours to do in the big picture of life and with your surroundings. Then you'll be in a good place, he's saying. So, tubehun lemeskeni baruch, ripe, blessedly ripe are those who, guess what? Who find their home in their breath, in their breathing. Because the word lemeskeni implies that the breath is our first and our last possession. So the image is though almost as though, okay, at this moment, I realize that breathing is really all I have. It was my first, gift when I came into this body, when I left my mother's womb, and it will be the last thing that departs when I leave this body, which is a gift of discovery. So he says, if you realize that your breath is your first and last possession, that's your starting place for entering this big, 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 big universe. Dilhone Malkuta Dashmaya, and not just a universe, but a universe that says and resonates with the words, I can, that is with vision, with power, with purpose. So purpose is very important in Jesus's teaching, and he links it to breath. So that here we have this word kingdom, which is used all over the New Testament, the kingdom of this, that, and the other thing. It really should really be queendom, because the Aramaic, as well as actually the Greek, when I looked it up, are feminine gendered, but the translators just made it masculine because that's what they did at those times. And even now, because they can't see it otherwise, um, this this resonance, this, you could say, this fiery choice, this sense of purpose is ringing through the whole universe. It's not like we're alone with our own little, sense of purpose and success and failure and all that. No, my purpose, when I really touch it, even if it's just for the moment, is part of this much, much bigger heart of the cosmos. And then the Beatitudes also go on from there and there. And, we start with breathing, and then the Beatitudes in Matthew, they're going, okay, then we breathe deeper, we feel the breath lower, we breathe into what is confused in us, what is mourning, and then we breathe even further down, we feel our belly and what he calls womb, which is the source of the word of this deeper radiant love. That's why you have the same word meaning womb, W-O-M-B, woman's womb, and love. It's the roots of one of the deepest words for love in the Semitic languages. So if we go way, way down deep, then we're going to find this very deep love that wells up from us. And then then it clarifies our vision. We can see clearly what is ours to do. And then we plant peace, and it goes on and on like that. So again, I've given you a 30-second, maybe a 1-minute gloss on the Beatitudes, but again, there's much more on this in the new book. It's also full of not the book, but Yeshua's teachings. The book is good too, but Yeshua's teachings in Aramaic are so full of wonderful things. I mean, the important thing for your listeners to realize, or if they're reviewing, is also, I was raised as a child, and they said, believe in Jesus, and that'll save your soul. But Jesus never asked us to believe in him. He asked us to, if you look at the preposition in Aramaic, actually in Greek too, I looked at it because I learned a bit of Greek to do the new book. He says, believe like me, believe as though you're within me. Have the same trust that I have, that this is one reality that we all share. So it's not believe concepts about me. He never asked people to do that. And he didn't say we need to save our soul. He says really much more, we need to let our soul save us. We need to let our soul, that is our rucha, the big breath's soul, self, save, redeem us, that is, help us fulfill our purpose for being here in these bodies for however many years we get. And, it turns the whole thing on its head. And these are some of the most, radical things I found over the last 40 years. And I still get enthused about them, as you can tell. It's very, very important now for people to hear this.
Well,
yeah, it's beautiful.
They're also incredibly empowering, right? I mean, I think that word gets so misoverused, empowering, and I think it actually gets flipped in a lot of ways too, what people think is empowering. But I mean, so much of what Jesus does is point back to ourselves, to have to kind of go back in, wrestle with the own stuff, or sit with it, breathe with it. And what I love about the word ripeness, because that doesn't come up. You don't see that word ripeness coming up in a lot of just traditional passages, but that sits so much. It feels so nice inside myself, because it feels like within that concept of ripeness, there's no one specific thing you can hang your hat on. It's like you have to come back, and the time is always changing depending on where you are, depending on what's going on. There's a self-reflective nature around that, where we are constantly in this impermanence, that things are always changing, and it's going back in, and it feels like then allowing our own knowing and personal instructions to surface, to then act spontaneously when the moment is ripe. And we will know it by going back inside and finding it ourselves. It's not like you're putting your authority to something outside of you to give you the answer. It's constantly causing you, or asking you, to come back and find it within and nurture that. That to me feels very different than a lot of what I usually hear. Because even when you were talking about believe, that comes up a lot. The other word that comes up a lot is followers, and to follow. And I feel like even that concept has a different meaning, because the word follow feels like you're handing over a little bit to somebody else. From that perspective, how would you interpret follow then when you hear that?
I interpret it in the ancient sort of Semitic way, where that we get to choose who who are who are guides, who we emulate, who we learn from. Perhaps when we're children, if we're fortunate, when we're learning language, for instance, we imitate our parents or whoever is in our surrounding, and we learn language. We learn to speak not from a book or not from an intellectual presentation, but simply from hearing and imitating and sounding and all of this. So when we're younger, hopefully we have, good models to imitate. But then, very quickly as we're reborn, we're born into a new sense of self, which usually occurs at various times throughout our life. Then we are more and more empowered, and how do we say? Well, we're responsible for making our own choices, rather than give those choices over to some authority, whether political, religious, or otherwise. And this is difficult for people, because people want to have the security, sense of safety of, connecting in a group and all of these things. And it doesn't mean we can't do this, but we still need to own our own, you could say, authority of making these choices. So
Yeah, I feel
that's where
like
I went with it anyway.
yeah, it's very much how it lands for me too. I feel like they're not exclusive. It's like you can still kind of have all of it. It's not that there's not aspects of external authority, but it's almost like everything still is being asked to run through yourself,
Yeah.
right?
Very,
And
very much so. And as I say, as we were talking about, whatever, 20 minutes or so ago, this is now where human consciousness is. This is where we are. It has its terrible sides. Absolutely. We see some of the bad choices all around us. But at the same time, this is the potential. The potential is to make proper choices. This reminds me of a line toward the end of Yeshua's prayer, the so-called Lord's Prayer, where it's usually translated, do not lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. I'm forgetting my King James Version here. I've blotted it out. Sorry. But it says, lead us not into temptation. Well, that was terrible when I was a children. Why is God leading us into temptation?
I
What's
had that
going on
same
here?
thought
And
around
no
that
one wants
too.
to answer this question. Well, there was Egypt and the Pharaoh and yada, yada, and on and on. But, they do double backflips to try to explain this theologically. Well, the simple thing is it was a mistranslation, not a limited translation. It's a mistranslation. And it should say, lead us not into, let us not enter. Do not let us enter temptation. But temptation actually just means forgetfulness in Aramaic, nisiyuna. And this means forgetfulness of who we are, where we came from in the bigger sense, and where we're going. So we have to always remember we came from something before birth, and we're heading to a further journey after physical death. And there's this bigger life. There's another world. So Jesus says, remember, he phrases it in the negative so that we simply acknowledge that, yes, we do forget. It's part of human consciousness to forget. And then the other part, deliver us from evil. It says, free us from unripeness, which is what the Aramaic word that's usually translated evil always means, just means not ripe. It's too soon, or it's too late, or it'll never be ripe, or it's like well past its sell-by date. Put it in the compost as a behavior. Bye-bye, sayonara. So it's, say, don't let us enter forgetfulness, but free us from this unripeness, not being present at the right time, at the right place, as you talked about, Jason, and making those ripe and right choices.
Gosh, like does that not sit so much easier and really take you away from judgment? Like because so much of what happens, it creates a lot of division because there's very strong, this is right, this is wrong behaviors. And when you understand that sort of teaching, it's hard to judge when it's really around forgetfulness. And that's an aspect of having this human experience that we are going to forget. So rather than judging as bad, can we not maybe then assist in the remembering, right?
Absolutely. Because judgment just paralyzes one. So when you're paralyzed by your past bad, oh, I made that bad choice, or my parents made that bad choice, and I fixated on that, then you're not free. You're not free to move ahead and make choices. So Jesus was not about guilt and judgment. That's a much later Christian concept. Original sin comes from St. Augustine, if you want to consider him a saint. I mean, my friend Matt Fox just calls him Augustine of Hippo, not the animal hippo, but he lived in Hippo. Sorry for those of you. um, so, this guy was having a bad day and he invented this notion and we've been living with it. So again, you can read my friend Matt Fox's books about all this, and he'll go into where we got original sin from. That's just why he called one of his early books Original Blessing. There's no original sin in the whole Bible. Period. End of story.
Isn't that crazy though? Because those became then a foundation for constructing quote unquote moral behavior.
Well, yeah, not only that, but Eve gave the apple to Adam and on and on and ay, 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 ay. So
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I most when I go through any of these, I just sit with what just sits really nicely inside my body. And when I read certain passages, they often sit so nice that they can move me to tears when I'm sitting with them, or they just feel restless. It just feels like that doesn't
yeah,
feel accurate to me, and some of those ones just they didn't make sense. But when I hear some of those words, like ripeness was one of those words, it just sat so comforting in my body hearing it, and the way that um, sat with, I guess, how I sort of live my life, or do the best I
yeah,
can to try and live my life. So
yeah, yeah,
it's so neat though, because when people, sometimes when you don't have to, it doesn't have to be lots. Sometimes you just hear certain pieces that kind of at the right moment, like when the time is ripe, and they hit you in a certain way that can really change your perspective. And then why I think that's so powerful, because like even in this series, this life, death, and beyond, the idea is, can something land that one of the speakers mentions or that you read about or that you hear about that just lands in the right way at the right time, that lets you now reshape your perspective of how you're living or your concepts around death even.
yeah.
Neil, what did Jesus say about death? I'm curious around that as well, just around the concept of death, around heaven and hell. The reason I want to talk about this is because there's so much fear tied to death, and I feel like anytime that we can add a broader lens on that concept, I think it helps people dealing with it or dealing with loved ones that are going through that.
Yeah, no, there's no question. It's a great service you're doing. You're both doing. Uh, Start with the words. The Aramaic word for death, moet, actually just means like a doorway, a transition. Simple. It does not mean the end. Roll the credits, anything like fini or anything like that. It's done. It means, this is a doorway into a wider reality. And it's the same in ancient Hebrew. Now, I'm not talking about modern Hebrew, I'm talking about ancient Hebrew, the Hebrew of the Bible. Same actually in classical Arabic. So the fear around death, and I'll go into heaven and hell in a moment, but the fear around death arises from this other trend in modern human consciousness, that only material reality exists, only what I can see and quantify and measure and manipulate with technology exists. And that ain't true. And it wasn't true for most of our human history. So, um, we need to work against this and against even materializing religious or spiritual concepts if we can avoid that, which one does see all around one. Uh, Heaven and hell, well, heaven, as I mentioned, is just this wider, much wider universe. Shemaya, as it's called in Aramaic. It's the world of the waveform. You could say the light that shimmers. It's that 0 point field, if you want to use, quantum field sort of language, but that makes it sound too sterile or nothing's going on there. It's where all potential is. Everything is potential. So the rucha, my rucha, which is always connected to everything, comes from this realm, goes through these embodied life experiences, and then travels on. And depending on who you believe or which way you want to interpret it, something of that comes back again. Now, if we want to get into this whole realm of ancient Middle Eastern reincarnation or not, but certainly what happens after we've dropped, we could say after my bigger breath self moves on, all the traditions say, biblical, Quranic, all the Semitic traditions say, including the ancient Egyptian, short time after so-called physical death, there is a sorting out process. So what the individual self, my I, nafsha in Aramaic, has not yet fully released, there's a period of time of releasing. And depending on how much I'm really holding on to things, and this can be from experiences in my past or possessions or things like this, but depending on how much I have to release, this could, it could take more or less time, but time is relative in the unseen. It's not measured in the time that we have in these minutes, seconds, and years. So, it's like going into, I said for one of my audiences when I was working on Quranic translation, the Quran talks about it like you go into a big sauna and, you're sweating out a bunch of stuff. But at some point, everybody gets out of the sauna. So the notion that there's some sort of eternal hell is completely unsemitic. That gets layered over onto, you could say, Hebrew, Aramaic, even Arabic, even in the Arabic of the Quran. It gets all tied together with this heaven and hell and original sin and all this stuff. Even if the traditions theoretically reject all these things, they start to envision it this way. We could say that where do the ancestors go? If you want to get really specific in your metaphysics, well, in the ancient world, this realm was felt to be, again, sort of underneath us in terms of a body awareness. And this is why we have the word, say, amen or ament in Egyptian, or amen in Aramaic. That is, what is underneath me is also sacred. What is in the darkness is also sacred. It's not just light that's sacred, but you could say what the unseen in all its dimensions is sacred. And so there's an underneathness, which is also filled with love, and filled with a sense of possibility where all this sorting out is going on. And then you could say the ruha travels on. But here it's very difficult. So you're describing things in time, space, language, where we're beyond human time and space. So all of the different, you could say, Semitic language, ancient nomadic traditions in the Middle East or Southwest Asia, as we might now call it, they tell it in story language and picture language, including the Egyptians, the Babylonians, the biblical, all of this. But it's mostly about this sort of sorting out. I don't really like the Egyptian Book of the Dead thing that much, where, they weigh your heart. And then if your heart is, I forget what it's, too heavy or too light, then the crocodile comes and eats it. It's like, I don't know. But, maybe the crocodile needs food and then you evolve, or the crocodile changes I don't know. It all gets rather fantastical. But again, these are the sorts of mythic story language, picture language, where, as I mentioned, humans were seeing the unseen world as an actual experience. It wasn't like they sat down, okay, we're going to sit down today and make up a nice story about the land of the dead. They actually were experiencing something that they experienced in images, sometimes poetry, sometimes music, song, and all of this was, you could say, sung. Even these ancient scriptures were mostly sung, like the Psalms were sung. And so people were they were bathed in this sort of cosmology, if you will. And the basic message was, do your best while you're here, reconnect, remember, be ripe, and, you'll have nothing to worry about on the other side. You'll be good. You be good.
That was one of my other questions around Eastern concepts such as reincarnation and what Yeshua would say to that. Can you go into a little bit more detail with regards to reincarnation and what was specifically said? And also karma, cause and effect as we know it. What was Yeshua's interpretation of these concepts?
Well, again, he wouldn't have thought about it in exactly those terms, but starting from the karma part, these are the karma bits are challenges, you could say. He talks about that we bring in from previous existence, and then what we're also sorting through in this life, opportunities which are challenges, shall we say, but that's for us to do. And then whatever we're left with at the end of this embodied story, hopefully we've gained something, hopefully we've gained more good stuff rather than gain more burdens, and that gets passed on. Did Yeshua believe in reincarnation? I'm often asked this question to you. Well, the Gospels mention that there was some idea of this at Yeshua's time in that area, because if you recall, at one point Jesus asked his students, his disciples as they're called, "Who do people say I am?" And one of them says, "Well, some people think you're Moses reborn, or other people think you're Elijah reborn," like that. And Jesus doesn't acknowledge either of those, but clearly those notions were around, that in some sense a prophet or a wise person, a wise one, could be brought through a person in this life. And hence also in the Gospel of John, Jesus talks about his connection with Abraham before there was this Abraham. You could say, my soul, my eternal soul, and I'm using overly common language, my eternal soul was already existing. So, he feels a connection with Abraham. And this is true in most of the Middle Eastern traditions, that even though they don't speak about reincarnation in an Eastern sense, they do talk about a possibility of connecting to the ancestors, that is, the wise ancestors, a prophet who has passed, and, if you will, downloading, you could say, abilities or skills or healing from that or through that conduit. That didn't alleviate one's responsibility to do things and make one's own direct connection to the source, to what Jesus calls Allah, which is the Aramaic word for unity or all that exists. Allah, not Allah, which is Arabic, but very, very much related. But, these are helps that the Middle Eastern tradition has this sense of connecting through what we would call in other traditions transmission to prophets or wise people, wise ones from the past. They were traveling ahead of us.
Thank you.
Fascinating. You had mentioned around the concept of unity. I know you talk in your book too around empowering a vision of unity. And I'll just, that was on page 85 here, I think, in this one, that I thought is really fitting right at the moment too, particularly. But you call it the empowering vision of unity. And one of the passages here, you just say, do we ever experience such a wholesale change in humanity of both consciousness and outer conditions? Isn't the usual way of outer revolution simply the replacement of one set of bad actors with another? By the same token, a change of inner awareness, while personally helpful, rarely affects mass culture. Yes, rarely, but not ever. We have seen situations where one person, sometimes previously insignificant in the eyes of mass culture, has a change of heart and affects the world in a huge way. I wonder if you can share a little bit around that process and about actually what's entailed to assist in creating a change that starts from within but can actually affect a really significant global change.
Well, yeah, the most important thing of what's necessary, and this is the most difficult, is to not expect that you're going to see results, and that you need those results to keep you going. This is absolutely the most difficult thing, Jason. So we want to see results. We want to have positive feedback, as it's called. We want acknowledgement. This is true. This is, again, a sort of a basic human need. But if I think about, okay, I want to change the world, um, how would you know, for one thing, if you did? Because actually, the way our actions, even our outer actions, ripple out and affect different people. We don't know. I don't know if some person that I touched or wrote to today, or wrote to my website, or this or that, they affect someone, they affect someone, they affect someone, and then you know we don't know that, and that is not, as I said earlier, quantifiable. It's not going to be reported on the nightly news, most likely. It does happen, however. When I originally wrote this sort of passage, I was thinking of, for instance, of Nelson Mandela, uh, who was this sort of figure where there was, at least within South Africa, an inner and an outer change of regime, but also an interchange of heart. Now, it didn't take long after Mandela was gone for things to sort of go pear-shaped again in South Africa. I have a number of friends there and have visited there many times. So, it's not like, okay, well, Mandela, he did it all for us, and now we can just coast. Sorry, it ain't going to happen. Jesus didn't do it all for you. You got to do some of it for yourself. So, you know, who knew about Nelson Mandela when he was sitting in prison for all those years? I mean, some people did, but not many. It wasn't the world. So
Hmm.
occasionally these things become newsworthy. Although today, I would say, in the culture of social media, as soon as someone gets noteworthy, then somebody's going to pile in, and there's going to be all these different opinions, a pro and con about the person. So
Yeah. I think that's really beautiful, though, around the idea that you can't really be attached to the quote
Mhm.
unquote proof or the outcome. That's come
the
up many
results,
times,
yeah,
and I know we've talked about it before too. And it's that idea that you're be okay with the idea of planting seeds for a tree that you may not get to enjoy the shade under at some
yeah,
point.
or that it may be already blossoming, this tree, and giving shade to many people, like Jesus talks about this mustard seed bush. I don't know, it's a hell of a bush, excuse my language. I think if it was going to give shade to all the animals, as it says in the Gospels. But anyway, it grows on its own. You didn't even know, no one planted it, the thing. It just grew wild. So maybe it's already growing, and you'll never know. And if you feel it in your heart that if I feel it in my heart, this is mine to do, I'm going to do it. You know.
Yeah.
So, and same for you, and you and Taya both. You just got to feel it and do it.
Yeah. I think that's the best guidance. I think it's just getting through. It kind of ties back almost full circle to even we were talking about the concepts of like old school chiropractic and naturopathic medicine and everything.
Yeah,
It's like there's this regard that there is this vital force, that we've got this self healing mechanism within our body, that all you really got to do is just get the obstacles impinging it out of the way and then allow it to start to do what it's designed to do. I think of that very much in all of this. It's like, the more I think that we're contemplative about it and spend the attention and the intention on what we're wanting to do, those obstacles gradually start to dissolve more and more, and we connect more to, and then we start to trust what what that inner physician is sort of telling us, or that inner guidance is telling us. So
absolutely. Yeah, well said. Yeah.
yeah, Neil, that was wonderful. Do you have any more questions, hon?
We have talked about language in the last series, with how language also plays a role in either expanding or limiting our worldview and our idea of what reality is. And and as far as your experience, I mean, you're essentially using the English language to go in and dive into Aramaic and Greek language and the other languages that you're interpreting into English. Is there hope for the English language, or do you find that it's going to continually now evolve to become more enriching within our lives, and how we're able to even perceive the nuances within our reality and greater reality?
It's an excellent question, Taya. There are, even though modern English, whether British or American, has become sort of the language of culture. Yeah, I don't mean like high culture, but the language of commerce, the language of the internet in many degrees, although Chinese internet is also quite huge. There, there are some advantages in English as I was using it to try to, I often, as I say, tortured English in order to try to translate Aramaic. You have to use poetic forms and some grammatical forms that actually aren't proper, but so you make up new words and a lot of this and the, again, translation, if you will, or you could say singing the language was part of it. So English does lend itself to poetry quite well, as long as there's something really behind the poetry and not just the manipulation of words and concepts. Uh, English makes it a little bit easier than other Western languages to blur the distinction between past, present, and future.
Mm.
You can do this what are called gerund forms, the ing, I am seeing you, seeing, or who is seeing, experiencing, perceiving, these forms. And also English can blur the distinction between what we now, a big issue, which we drop in just toward the end, this gulf between so-called maleness and femaleness, which was never there in the ancient cultures, never there in Aramaic.
Mm.
So English can help us, can blur those distinctions. So again, the ancient notion of gender in this area, in Yeshua's area, was that, as it is in the Bible, they were all born with a soul that is an intermingling of what we would call maleness and femaleness, and we express this in different ways at different times. And some of us express more of this, some express more than that. So, there's already an sort of intergendered soul that's mentioned even in Genesis, and this is largely ignored. But we see again in outer culture now people trying to, live this live this outwardly in some way, or live this inside outwardly, and yeah, it's again part of this tendency to try to bring what's already within into an outer realm. So, but English, there is hope for English, some hope. You have to, speaking as a poet or as a person who's done this sort of translation, there's certain types of words you have to avoid. And these are the ones that tend to end in ism or like conceptual, or they become purely abstract, purely intellectual language, and using more sort of living language, being verbs, images. Well, it's really a sense of poetry, really.
Mm. Thank you. Neil, is Yeshua coming back?
When? When?
Like
Oh,
tomorrow?
when?
As far as the second coming and
Oh,
the
gosh.
things that we've heard about, is what is your understanding of that within the text that you studied?
I wrote a whole book about this, Taya, but
Which
it's
one is
called
Which one was that one?
it's called Original Meditation, in that the original meditation of the ancestors in Yeshua's area and Yeshua himself was not on how things are going to end up at the end of time, of all time, but on where we come from, on the, you could say, on the origins, on the you could say on the creation story as a living story, that we're all being created and recreated every moment. So they weren't focused on this strange ideas of the end times, the second coming, the rapture. All of these are extracts of an interpretation of the book of Revelations, which isn't, since we're sort of running out of time, if anyone's interested in Revelations, I would point people to the book by C.G. Jung called Answer to Job. At least half of that book, which is a very, very profound book. And actually, people find it difficult to read. I found it very easy to read because it speaks of what the same thing that Yeshua was talking about. He takes apart what Revelations really is, which is about really a journey in deep, deep, deep within the self. And then how that deep journey is what humanity is undergoing right now, and that there will be, perhaps at some point, a new sense of the human that is born. But Jesus himself, I don't know. We have this in Islam also. In some versions of Islam, there's a notion that Jesus is going to come again. It's, it's interesting that it's in Islam also. But the Quran says, interestingly enough, that all people, I think I can quote it more or less accurately, if at the end of time, all people will be measured by what the prophet that they are connected to, what was doing. It's like, not that we had to do the same as Jesus, but it's like, have we lived up to what those teachings really are? Have we lived them in our own lives, rather than try to, just say, I believe in Jesus and I believe ... on and on, a particular creed. It's not about that. So I think that's quite wise. And people will be, if there is a judgment or a measuring, which is a better word than judgment, there will be a measuring in that way. But really what we're measured against is our soul's potential. And it's not like, okay, guilty, innocent, all,
Mhm.
that sort of thing. It's like, okay, well, here is your potential that you had in this embodied life, and here's what you did, and look at it all with love, and release what you can release, and then next time try again.
That's actually very much how it's come from some of the different near-death experiencers when they talk about a review
A life
and a
review.
life review, and it literally is. And what we got to understand too from that is, at least the way they explained it, was that it's also being done from a point of view of being in a place of unconditional love. So you're not judging anything, but you're seeing it exactly like you talked about. Here's kind of what the sort of either part of your life plan, what you came to kind of do. Here's the potential. Here's kind of where you did.
And you're actually feeling all of it. So you're feeling not only what you felt at the time that you, whatever it was, whatever that thing that was that you did to another person, but also you're feeling and perceiving it from the viewpoint and the place of the other person. Not only that, but all the ripples that it created from there on.
Mm-hmm.
And it's this instant knowing of that. And it is said that that was one of the hardest experiences in the afterlife, that life review period too,
Yeah.
because it's a tangible knowing of how your actions, your speech, your thought affected everything and everyone around you.
But from that place of unconditional love. So judgment's not
Absolutely.
tied into it, which I think is a hard thing to grasp completely unless you ever experience what it's like to view the world through unconditional love. But something to aspire to. I know
Let's do it.
yeah, I agree. I agree. I know my concept when I think about a second coming is I feel like all of us are the second coming. It's to embody
Sure.
those teachings and be that as much as we can in the world. And I think don't wait for somebody else or anything else to come. It's now's the time. Embody it yourself and sort of be that
Sure.
in the world. Neil, that was really wonderful. Do you have any final words for the audience before we finish everything up around this concept of life, death, and beyond, exploring our greater reality?
Well, one of my Sufi teachers says, this whole notion of the day of quote a big judgment, it really means this is a day means a moment in the Quran, for instance, in the Quran. It's the same in Aramaic. This is a moment, every moment is a moment of decision, because the word for judgment really means deciding, sorting things out. Every moment is our opportunity to decide and choose from the heart what we're going to let go of from our past and what we're going to do next. Simple.
Yeah, keep it simple.
Beautiful.
Beautiful. Neil, where can people learn more about all of your work? You've got a load of different books. Where can we send people to get all of your information?
You can send them, Jason, to my website, Aboon. That's ABWOON, ABWOON. First word of Jesus's prayer, aboon.org, O-R-G. And it's all, there's a lot of free resources to download. You can hear Jesus's prayer in Aramaic. You can actually learn it by clicking on buttons, if you will, all that stuff. So there's a lot of lovely stuff there. My
Would it,
books are all there and everything.
would it be okay if we actually finished off with the prayer incomplete, if you don't
Sure.
mind?
Happy to.
Thank you.
So let's breathe. The first word, Awun, the breathing life of all. Connection of our own breathing to the source and to all that is around us. Breathing abun, ahun. Ahun de bashmaya, nitqad shemuch, de te mal kutach. Nechwe sibianach aikana diba shemaya afbar ah. Hublan lachma de soon kanan yamana. Washbuklan chabain wachtehen. I Canada Hanan Spachan Hayabin. Willa Tachlan Linisuna Illa Patsan Min Bisha. Metu Lilache Mal Kuta. Wahaila Wateshbuchta. Le'alam Almin. Amen. The Lam Almin. Amen. Thanks to both of you. Thanks for what you're doing. Thanks to everybody listening in.
Thank you, Neil.
Much love to you,
Much
Neil.
love.
Thank you.
Take care. Have a great rest of your day.
That